The emergence of international standards has just grown absolutely exponentially. I won't read it all. You may have a chance to look at these someplace else. But it's absolutely astonishing the number of international developments that have occurred with respect to corruption and the law. The idea behind bribery particularly has been to legislate against it, to criminalize it. And these are all the tools that have been brought into play to criminalize the bribery of foreign public officials. So one of the questions we need to ask ourselves, and for many people it's a very uncomfortable question, is whether or not it's been effective. Has it made any difference? So we want to evaluate the results of these legislative initiatives, starting with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, did it really create an unlevel playing field for American corporations? A colleague of mine, a PhD student, were very concerned because I was being pushed as president of Transparency International to move on the legislative front, and I was never persuaded that that was going to be an entirely effective vehicle. We did move in the end because my board wanted to, and I could see it had its virtues, but I also wanted to evaluate this, and so we undertook a study of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Other people have done it. It was a study that turned out to be extremely unwelcome in Transparency International and was demonstrated to be an uncomfortable study, but demonstrated, I think, to be relatively accurate by virtue of another tool that Transparency International developed, which is called the Bribe Payers Index. Now, you've heard about the bribe or the Corruption Perception Index. The Bribe Payers Index is meant to be the balancing study that talks about the supply side of corruption. Now, in 2002, the OECD Anti-Corruption Convention was just coming into effect. It was just beginning to be applied by a small number of countries. So if there was any legislative impact, it should have been the impact of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And everyone expected that the Bribe Payers survey would demonstrate that this was the case, that the American corporations were playing on an unlevel playing field, that they were disadvantaged by corruption. So what did the Bribe Payers Index? Well, the Bribe Payers Index was an index which was based on surveys of third world public officials and others in third world countries who faced corporations offering bribes for services which they frequently didn't deserve. So this is a third world response to a first world supply phenomenon. And there were 29 countries, I believe the list was shown. Those are the first 11. Now it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because the United States doesn't appear on that list. Canada does. Canada appears systematically quite high on these indexes. The United States doesn't appear. Well, there's the bottom half of the list, and the United States is number 13. That's to say American corporations were rated by third world people who were involved in this process as more likely to offer bribes to win contracts than companies from more than 50% of the other countries that were rated in this particular case. So these are exporting countries that we're talking about, and it's there on a par with Japan. What's rather interesting about this, if I go back just one, is that there you'll see Germany is number 9. And Germany allowed the deduction of bribes as legitimate income tax expenses until, I think, about 1999. So that's an interesting result. And it suggests that it wasn't an uneven playing field, or it did not, in fact, have a significant impact on the behavior of American corporations. People get furious with me when I say that, because in fact it had an enormous impact on the conduct of American corporations. They hired lawyers and they hired accountants in great numbers, and they had conventions and workshops all over the place. But in terms of their conduct, that's to say, in terms of their tendency to offer bribes, as nearly as I could make out in that study, and as the Bribe Payers Index suggests, it had virtually no impact on the ethical quality, if you like, of the conduct of American corporations internationally. So, very little evidence then that these initiatives, well, the conclusion then is that the FCPA has not had a significant positive impact. And if you look at what's going on now, and there are various studies, there was a very interesting program offered by PBS on corruption. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, it might be something you'd be interested in seeing. But on the basis of those programs and work done by others, there's very little evidence that bribery is declining in its influence or its extent internationally in international markets. So, a comment then on legislative tools. An obvious conclusion for me is then that if we're going to look for tools or solutions, we have to look someplace else. That's not to say that the law is not important, but I've always been of the view that laws which are not culturally supported in some sense, that they don't have social backing behind them, that people don't recognize independently of the law that they have an obligation to obey the law and to support the standards that the law has created, that the law is unlikely to have a significant effect on the behavior of people. So until we change people's attitudes toward corruption, we're not going to, in my view, make much progress. So the question is how you do that. Take that. Well, I'm going to suggest that making business managers more ethical is not the challenge and should not be the focus of our initiatives. And that runs against some of the themes, I think, that have been developing here. I don't think that personal greed is the problem. I just don't think that personal greed is the issue. The problem, in my view, is the view that the fundamental obligation of managers, particularly senior management, is to maximize profits for owners and shareholders. I think that's the key. And that's the principle on which the free market is today based. That's the principle that drives our largest corporations, in my view. So specifically, then I want to argue, we have to persuade managers in the business community to accept that the view that profit maximization is the sole or primary responsibilities of managers in the private sector has very destructive implications under conditions of globalization. And the question then is why? Why does it have this destructive implications? Now, this is a complex problem, and I'm going to paint with a very broad brush, but I think this is the crux of the problem I'm going to put forward. The proposition that the fundamental obligation of managers is to maximize share value instrumentalizes both law and ethics and prioritizes the pursuit of self-interest. That's the effect of that particular doctrine on which our system is based. So we need to talk a little bit about what it means to instrumentalize law and ethics, because I think it's the key element. Essentially what it means is that managers should pay attention to ethics or law only where it can be demonstrated to facilitate profit maximization. That's essentially what it means, or to put it slightly differently, ethics and obeying the law are important only as a means to the end that managers are in place to serve, namely maximizing profits. So when you look at issues of legal compliance, or you look at issues of ethical standards, then the key question from the point of view of senior managers, particularly in international corporations, is what's the impact on the bottom line of this system rules that we're being asked to respect? What that does, what the focus on profit maximization does, is that it shapes compensation systems. The compensation systems that are in place in the corporate sector, particularly at the management level, are specifically designed to align the interests of senior managers with the interests of shareholders. That's the whole drive behind the compensation system, and it's the key issue which is faced by agency theory, which I think maybe Jeff you mentioned when you were talking about it. Agency theory is a theory which attempts to understand how to manage so as to align the self-interests of the various players who are involved in the corporate game, if you like, to put it in a somewhat pejorative